For this 3-1 work together problem, we are going to be on page 315 of the textbook and 283 of the journal. It says that for each employee, calculate the amount of regular, overtime, and total earnings. Overtime hours are paid at 1.5 times the regular rate. That means 1.5 times the regular rate. In this problem, we have 4 different people, 4 different employees. This first employee worked 40 regular hours, 5 overtime hours. So to figure out their regular rate, their regular earnings using their regular rate, you would take their regular hours and multiply by the regular rate. So that's going to be 40 times $9. So employee number 1 made $360 working regular hours. They also worked some overtime. Remember that overtime, it said that the overtime's rate is 1.5 times the regular rate. So if the regular rate is 9, we have to multiply 9 by 1.5 to figure out what the overtime rate would be for 1 hour. $13.50 is 1 hour's worth of overtime. It looks as if they worked 5 hours of overtime. So you have to do 5 times their overtime rate. And you would get that their overtime earnings are $67.50. Their total earnings are found by adding their regular and their overtime earnings. So this employee 1 has earned $427.50 in total earnings for this pay period. The employee number 2 also worked 40 hours. Their hourly rate was a little bit more though, so you have to multiply your 40 hours times their hourly rate, meaning the rate of pay per hour, 40 times $12.50. This employee 2 made $500 in regular earnings. They also worked 3 hours of overtime. Their overtime rate is going to be different than employee 1's overtime rate because it was based on 1.5 times their rate. We have to figure out what 1.5 times employee 2's rate is, so that's going to be $12.50 times 1.5. It's going to be $18.75 of overtime per hour. Now, this employee number 2 worked 3 hours at that rate, so you take that rate and multiply it by 3, and you get that they made $56.25 working overtime. Their total earnings is found by adding their regular earnings to their overtime earnings. 500 plus $56.25 is going to be $556.25. Employee 3 worked 30 regular hours and no overtime hours, so we don't need to calculate their overtime rate. 30 times 9.75 will tell us what they earned. They earned $292.50. Their overtime hours, their overtime earnings are 0 because they didn't work any overtime hours. Therefore, their total earnings is the same as their regular earnings. Employee number 4 worked a 40-hour work week at $11 an hour, so their regular earnings would be found by doing 40 times the number of times the rate per hour, which is $440. They worked 2 hours of overtime. We need to calculate their overtime rate by taking their regular rate and multiplying it by 1.5, meaning 1.5 times it. What does that equal? $16.50 per hour. So therefore, you take the 2 hours they worked overtime, multiply it by the rate per hour, and you get $33 in overtime. Employee 4's total earnings are found by adding their regular to their overtime. They made $473 in total earnings. That is how you prepare a payroll time card when overtime rates are 1.5 or 1.5 times. You now should work on the next step in your checklist.